Every story has a beginning. This one starts with a pile of mail. Jean Marc Richard has just returned from vacation with his family. His suburban Montreal home is pretty much as they left it, except for what's accumulated in their mail. Bills, flyers, and so on. For the young people listening, back in 1999 when this story started, people still got a lot of mail. Jean Marc's 9-year-old son is helping him sort through it all, making 2 piles. Keep, trash, trash, keep. When something catches his eye. It's different from the other envelopes. It's sort of official looking. The letter is from Time magazine, in English only. At the top, it says in all caps, "Official sweepstakes notification." Jean Marc is francophone, so instead of trying to piece it together, he hands it to his son to read out loud, as a way to test his English. There's a lot written in that letter, but a few sections stand out. They're in big type.
Our sweepstakes results are now final. Mr. Jean Marc Richard has won a cash prize of $833,337. We are now authorized to pay $833,337 in cash to Mr. Jean Marc Richard. You will forfeit the entire $833,337 if you fail to respond to this notice.
So, after reading the contents of the envelope, my son told me that we had just won $833,000 in the Time magazine sweepstake. I then reviewed the content of the envelope.
And the content of that envelope is the beginning of a legal fight that takes Jean Marc Richard all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. But right now, at this moment, it's just a father and son staring at a piece of mail and wondering if they've struck it rich. I'm Falen Johnson, and this is See You in Court, a podcast about the cases that changed Canada. Today we're ripping into the case of Richard and Time. It's a story about a guy who turns a single piece of junk mail into a legal battle over consumer rights. And to tell this story, we're going to bring in Craig Desson. So Craig, Jean Marc gets this letter saying he's won hundreds of thousands of dollars from Time magazine. If I got this letter, I'd probably assume it was a scam and throw it out. But this is not what he does.
No, Falen. In fact, he does the exact opposite.
At that point, I decided to participate by following all the instructions mentioned in Time magazine's mailing.
He fills out the enclosed form and returns it to Time. He even uses registered mail to make sure it gets there. Falen, you could say Jean Marc is pushing the envelope.
You could say that, but I wouldn't.
A joke. It's a joke. It's funny. So not long after that, he starts getting his subscription to Time magazine, which was sort of the reason Time was running the sweepstakes.
And what about that sweepstakes money, that $833,337?
The money was nowhere to be found. So he wanted to know what the hell was going on. He re-examines the letter, and he finds a clue. A list of 14 people that apparently have been paid their prize money in full. For example, there is Jay Fuller from Boise, Idaho, who has been paid, and I quote, $100,000 cash. Jean Marc's name is on that list too. So he decides to track down the people listed in the letter to find out if they had gotten their money. But remember, this is the 90s. You just can't message people on Facebook. Instead, he uses something us elder millennials like to call a phone book.
Ah, yes. Take me back to the days of the phone book, Craig.
It was amazing. You could order pizza.
You could look up your teachers.
It was really a miracle of 20th century publishing. And luckily for Jean Marc, he has a friend with a collection of phone books. So he finds the numbers for some of the people listed on the letter, and he gets his friend with better English skills to give them a call. Jean Marc says everyone he called says they actually won the money from time.
We realize this is real, but I'm still convinced at that time I have to fight if I want to get my money.
Okay, but how do you fight a piece of mail?
You don't give up, Falen. You see, Jean Marc sees another clue in the envelope. That letter is signed by a person with a very important sounding job title, Elizabeth Matthews, Director of Sweepstakes. So Jean Marc picks up the phone again and calls Time Magazine's office in Manhattan.
I called Sweepstake Director Elizabeth Matthews to find out when I would receive my check.
And he gets through to someone in the marketing department.
Then they explained me she didn't physically exist and I don't want any prices.
Elizabeth Matthews isn't a real person. And the marketing rep says the letter Jean Marc received was merely an invitation to participate in the sweepstakes. You see, Falen, in the midst of all the big, bold type on the letter to Jean Marc saying he was a winner, there is also a claim number, which is Jean Marc's entry number for a sweepstakes. A sweepstakes he did not win.
So no check.
No check.
I know hindsight is 20/20, but I think we all saw that coming.
Well, easy for you to say, Falen. I can feel Jean Marc's pain. When I was a kid, I got a similar letter in the mail. It wasn't the same letter that Jean Marc received, but I thought I had won a huge sweepstakes from Publishers Clearinghouse. The thing looked pretty darn official. It came in this huge envelope and it had my name on it. And I remember going to school the next day, dreaming what I could do with all that money.
And what did you dream of, Craig?
I dreamt of hoverboards. I dreamt of Pokemon cards. Mm-hmm. I dreamt of dropping out of middle school and starting a podcast.
But let me guess, you didn't win.
I sure didn't. And here's the thing you got to know. I wasn't the only person getting those letters. Back in the 80s and 90s, these types of sweepstake letters were being delivered to homes across North America. And they all drew on a similar formula. Big fonts screaming to
act now,
that it is
guaranteed,
and that you need to fill out the form
immediately.
Don't you know you could win $2 million?
Those contests aren't for real.
That's what we used to think.
But this check is real.
There were even cheesy television ads speaking right to skeptics. You can still find some of them on YouTube, like this one from Publishers Clearinghouse. And yes, some people did in fact win.
Yes. Mrs. Stankiewicz? Yes. You just won $10 million from Publishers Clearinghouse.
Like this Sudbury woman who was surprised at her door with balloons and flowers.
10 million?
Yes.
If I believe it, I will just faint it.
But most people, like me and Jean Marc, were losers.
So if everyone is getting these letters back in the 1990s, why is Jean Marc the only person asking questions?
Well, there may be other people asking questions, but Jean Marc has something most people don't have. He owns a successful business with clients in Quebec, the US, and Japan. And that also means he has a lawyer.
Okay, the letter is confusing, but is it illegal enough to sue? Like, how would that even work?
I had the same question. How do you sue someone over junk mail? What makes this piece of paper different from all the other marketing promises that get stuffed in our mailbox? The answer is sitting in a frame on the 37th floor of a Montreal skyscraper. That's where I met Hubert Cibre, Jean Marc's lawyer.
Hey, how are you? Good, thanks for coming. Nice to meet you in person.
He's the guy who looked at this piece of junk mail and saw something most people didn't see. A lawsuit.
So this is the original sweepstake document that Jean Marc Richard did receive.
Hubert still keeps the letter on his wall.
And I remember when Jean Marc sent it to me the first time, I had to read it 3 times to understand what the trick of the document was.
The trick of the document. It says Jean Marc is the winner. But if you read the fine print, there's a very important word, if. As in, if you have and return the grand prize winning entry in time.
So they're saying he could win if he has the winning entry.
Exactly. And if you dig into their official rules, the real fine print of the letter, you'll find that Time states the estimated odds of winning 1 in 120 million.
1 in 120 million. I do not like those odds.
Neither does Hubert. But he sees an opportunity to fight back.
And I said, you know what? We're going to sue them. We're going to sue them.
Hubert sounds pretty confident.
Yeah, he is, because Quebec has something called the Consumer Protection Act, which sets out the rules for how companies need to treat consumers.
Sometimes you need to take a stand on some situation, particularly in order to defend what seems to be exactly the point of the Consumer Protection Act, is making sure that misleading information is not disseminated and that a bunch of consumers get misled.
Okay, stop right there. I think I'm going to need you to fill me in on what the Consumer Protection Act is.
The Act does a lot of things. It's huge. In fact, if you're ever having trouble falling asleep, I highly recommend reading the Consumer Protection Act.
Okay, noted.
An important part of this law is it defines what a misleading advertisement is. It does this using a legal concept that became known as the general impression test. The test seems simple enough. A consumer looks at an ad.
That's because new Tide has extra cleaning power. With Tide, things always come out clean and fresh as a sea breeze.
Whatever impression that person comes to when looking at the ad,
Band-Aid plastic strips with new Super Stick stick better than any other Band-Aid.
And a literal reading of the ad, that's how you evaluate whether an ad is misleading or not.
Raid! Raid contacts and kills all kinds of bugs indoors. Raid hunts them down like radar.
And Hubert figures Jean Marc Richard's sweepstake letter gives the general impression that he is the big winner. So Hubert files a lawsuit, asking for the full amount Jean Marc Richard was told he had been awarded, $833,337.
I felt pretty good that the facts were in my favor, but the law was in somewhat uncharted territories.
Uncharted territories because nobody had tried to sue a company for this kind of sweepstakes advertising and for so much money. At his trial, Jean Marc takes a stand. He tells the judge that after he found out he didn't win, he was disappointed, confused, frustrated. He lost sleep over the letter. The judge is sympathetic to Jean Marc's story. They win the case against Time.
A judge ruled yesterday the U.S. magazine based in New York was guilty of false advertising.
But that $833,337 they're asking for, well, they end up getting a lot less. Justice Carol Cohen reduces the amount to $101,000. Hubert says it's still a huge win.
I believe at the time, $100,000 of punitive damages to a single plaintiff was the highest amount that had ever been given by a court in Quebec. So that was a great success.
But the success doesn't last long. Time appeals.
Then we went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal said, I don't see, how Justice Cohen was right, and they reversed the whole thing.
So what does the appeal court disagree about?
Okay, Falen, we're going to go down a legal rabbit hole here. Remember the general impression test I talked about earlier?
I do. What a consumer thinks when they look at an ad, that's how the law judges the ad.
Yes, but here's the thing. Not everyone has the same general impression because not everyone is the same. In the ruling, the appeal court wades into what we can expect from the average consumer.
And what does that mean, the average consumer?
Great question. The ruling pictures the average consumer to be, quote, moderately intelligent, moderately skeptical, and moderately curious. And the ruling points out that an international businessman should have known his chances of winning the sweepstakes from the start. And when Hubert sees that, he's pretty sure the appeal court won't have the last word on this case.
When I got the decision from the Court of Appeal, there was a colleague of mine working with me on this file, and she was really mad about losing before the Court of Appeal. And she looked at me and says, "Why are you smiling?" And I says, "Well, we're going to the Supreme Court."
Hubert sees a glaring problem with the Court of Appeal's assessment of the average consumer. If you are only protecting the moderately intelligent, moderately skeptical, and moderately curious consumer, then what about everyone else? What about elderly people who might have trouble with the fine print? The person who doesn't speak English well? The consumer who is, well, gullible?
They should be protected too.
That's exactly Hubert's point. He points to a newer understanding of the average consumer that's gaining currency in legal circles in the 60s and 70s. It's a push to protect as many people as possible. This new definition of the average consumer needs to include people who are credulous, as in they believe what they see. So this case becomes almost an existential question about who consumers are, and therefore how to protect them.
We're still talking about junk mail, though, right?
Yes, but this whole thing has gone way further than expected. It's moved beyond consumer law into other aspects of the law. It's referred to in those cases as well.
This sounds really intense. How is Jean Marc feeling about his piece of mail leading to such a big court case?
He's ready to rumble.
Well, I'm a fighter and I have to go at the very end of everything. That's the way it is. I'm like that.
Jean Marc never thought he'd be here, walking into the Supreme Court of Canada. It's 2011, more than a decade after the sweepstakes letter landed in his mail. It's also the first time at the highest court for his lawyer, Hubert Sibre, and it feels like the legal Super Bowl.
You're going to be arguing in front of some of the best legal minds of the country. They know the file. You're going to get drilled to the core. And so you have to prepare, and you are extremely nervous, like a comedian, having to go on stage.
One of the lawyers representing Time is Fadi Amin. This is his first Supreme Court case too.
This wasn't a very serious case. That was my first impression. I don't think anybody expected it to go to the Court of Appeal, let alone to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Merci. Pouvez-vous vous asseoir? Jean Marc Richard.
But once the hearing begins, it's very clear the justices take it all very seriously.
What is the test, then, of the average consumer?
Shouldn't we expect the reader not only to read the title of the article, but also what the article says?
Are you suggesting that the standard should be lower in consumer protection cases?
The justices are all holding copies of Jean Marc's sweepstakes letter, and they're picking it apart, word by word, comma by comma.
I think there's a difference between reasonable and average.
Jean Marc is sitting in the courtroom, following along.
So it's very, very technical and legal.
The judges go back and forth between Hubert, Fadi, and another lawyer for Time, asking them questions so deep in the legal weeds that even though they're speaking English, you have almost no idea what they're talking about.
And you might consider paragraph 49 of the judgment at trial, which appears at page 20 of the record, where the trial...
And then the official ending of this historic Supreme Court case.
Microphone, please. The court is adjourned.
It's over. The justices file out of the room. It takes a little over a year for the Supreme Court to reach its decision. But when the ruling is released in February 2012, it's a unanimous decision.
The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled in favor of a Quebec man who sued Time magazine after he lost a mail-in sweepstakes he thought he had won.
But this isn't simply a victory for a man who held onto a piece of junk mail.
Right. This case is really about who consumers are and what they are expected to understand about advertising.
Exactly. Time magazine and their lawyers were trying to argue that consumers can be expected to be a bit savvy.
We were trying to convince the court that that objective standard of the average consumer should be more like the one used most often at the time in the United States, which was he's not a scientific person, but he's not a moron in a hurry.
A moron in a hurry. The Falen Johnson story.
But that's the title of my autobiography.
Oh.
But in all seriousness, those aren't Fadi's words. Those are words from UK case law. Instead, Canada's highest court goes with the definition of the average consumer as credulous and inexperienced. Marketers can't assume they'll understand the fine print of a sweepstakes letter like the one that landed in Jean Marc's mail.
Okay, but I have something to ask you. Was Jean Marc really this credulous and inexperienced consumer? Like, did he really believe he had won the sweepstakes?
It's a great question. He certainly testified in court that he did. But when I talked to him for this podcast, and he told me it was the first media interview he'd ever done about this case, it was left a little bit unclear. He said he can't really remember what he believed and when. But here's the thing. Fadi says in some ways, that's beside the point.
It didn't matter because what the Supreme Court came and said, and that's what it clarified on that legal standard, was that it's not the understanding of Mr. Richard that's important.
The legacy of this case goes beyond Jean Marc and his mail. So, for example, Canada's Competition Bureau still uses this standard of credulous and inexperienced consumer in its advice to businesses to avoid misleading advertising. And Hubert tells me that the case is one reason why this kind of sweepstakes marketing started to disappear.
So, welcome.
The case also had a big impact on both lawyers' careers.
I told my wife I'm going to be on the national Ian advancing.
And get this, Falen. Hubert, who worked for the case for Jean Marc, and Fadi, who argued for Time, now both work at the same Montreal law firm. And that's where I met up with them to talk about this case. They still like to tease each other about who really won.
But I'm happy for him to think that he won. I still think that I won. So this is great, That's the best of all worlds.
Well, I'm happy that he knows I won.
Okay, so why do they both think they won the case?
Remember when Jean Marc was awarded just over $100,000?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Supreme Court awarded him $16,000, and that's Canadian dollars.
Oh.
Fadi says this lower settlement had an important impact on Canadian lawsuits. It's a reason why we have lower payouts than in the U.S.
My opinion is that the Supreme Court cut the baby in half and that the result was mitigated. Hubert was successful on some points on consumer protection. I was successful on others and on punitive damages as well. Hubert was successful in obtaining them. We were successful in limiting their scope.
So to keep the fun going, I got the better half of the baby.
He can keep it.
I have questions about what is the better half of a baby?
And I think I know which half of the baby I'd prefer.
Okay, that is fair. But what does Jean Marc think of his win?
Yeah, I'm gonna let him state the obvious.
Well, of course, I was disappointed because of the amount.
He never won his big sweepstakes prize. But maybe he won something bigger. Because Jean Marc told me it wasn't just about the money.
I can imagine someone who get difficulties at the end of the month to pay their debts or whatsoever, receive that letter and believe they want $833,000 US dollar. That changed their life for those people. Time try to make money with the dream of poor people. That's why I decided to go to the end with that story.
I did reach out to Time magazine to ask them for their thoughts on the case and about whether the sweepstakes letter was, as Jean Marc says, a way to make money with the dreams of poor people. And as of now, as we're recording this, they haven't written back to me.
So, for me, it sounds like even though Jean Marc Richard didn't win his big prize, Time magazine still messed with the wrong average consumer.
They sure did, and I wish I had a mail pun here to end my little podcast with.
Okay, so
mail
Craig?
Yeah.
How did a ghost start a letter?
How?
To whom it may concern.
Ooh.
Why did the doctor call the post office?
Are you just coming up with these as you're going? Or do you have like a file in your head of just jokes about the post office?
No, I'm stealing them from the internet like a normal person.
Oh, you're just Googling them.
Anyway, the doctor called the post office because he needed help delivering a baby.
Which half, Falen? Which half?
The good half went priority. If you like this episode, share it with a friend, someone who might be into the untold stories behind the cases that changed Canada, or someone who likes bad puns. That works too. And join me next week for a special 3-part series about a little girl whose adoption case changed child welfare in Canada. For the first time, Letitia Racine speaks about what impact that case had on her life. You've been listening to See You in Court. The show is hosted and produced by me, Falen Johnson. Craig Desson wrote and reported this episode. Catherine Rolfson is our senior producer. Sam McNulty is our sound designer. Carla Hilton is our executive producer. Thank you to the Supreme Court of Canada for use of its recordings. Also to the Prelinger Archives for some of the old ads we played in this episode. And to Marie-Eve Arbor at the University of Laval.